So the question, what was it like to be a child in the middle of a genocide? Um, I give a little bit of background because leading up to the genocide was already scary times. I was 10 years old when the war started in 1990. The war had six major things happening in a period of 4 years. One was major atrocities, massacres, where the rebels, the RPF, a group called the RPF, which is now the group that's in government in Rwanda today, started a war from Uganda and would call people to meetings like this, hundreds of people, surround them and throw grenades into crowds of people. And the survivors would be killed with hand weapons and things like that. So those were stories that I was hearing from the war front. The second thing was displacement, people being moved from, not moved, sorry, move is not the right thing. They were chased from their communities by these rebels, and they were fleeing into the city of Kigali and other parts of Rwanda, but the city of Kigali is where I lived. And there was over 1 million people that came into the city of Kigali fleeing these rebels. And the rebel was a group of exiled Tutsis that came from Uganda. Tutsi is one of the ethnic groups in Rwanda. Rwanda has three: Hutus, Tutsis, and Twas. And so this group started the war. They're committing these atrocities. People are running away from their homes. They're completely homeless, have nothing. And they look like, the children look like, if you ever seen the commercials from like Feed the Children or something like that, that's how the people looked. I had never seen anything like that before. The other thing that was happening were terror attacks. One of the generals today in the Rwanda military, General Karenzi Karake, was leading a campaign of bombing marketplaces and bus stations. So if any of you have been to one of the developing countries, there are thousands and thousands of people, crowds of people. People were getting blown up. And so when we went to school, we weren't sure that we would even make it home. The other thing was political riots. There were political parties that Rwanda introduced a multi-party system. And when that multi-party system was introduced along with the war and everything that was going on, there were also street riots. And that added to the dangers. The fifth thing was the weapons everywhere. There were so many weapons that normal crime, things like using wartime weapons, heavy guns and grenades and all kinds of explosives. And the sixth thing was political assassinations. One of the things that really, really brought people on edge was high-ranking politicians in Rwanda getting assassinated at different times. And the biggest assassination, not only in Rwanda, in the world, is what started the genocide. Two presidents, the Rwandan and Burundian presidents, were assassinated together on a plane while they were traveling back to Rwanda. Their plane was shut down, and that started the genocide. And what happened in the genocide was that night, so April 6, 1994, as a child, so child story, we were in a tournament, in a soccer tournament on April 6th. We had won, and we were going to the final of this tournament in Kigali. I was really excited. And then I heard the explosions that killed the presidents. And I just thought, you know what, this is just the usual gunfire in Rwanda. And then somebody called and spoke to my mother. And my mom, I mean, she totally changed. And then she told us, somebody shot the president's plane. My reaction was, oh man, I hope the president didn't get killed, because if he got killed, we're not gonna be able to finish our soccer tournament. That was my main worry. So again, the child story. Immediately after that, I realized that the game was no longer that important. The soccer game, the soccer tournament was no longer important because we started hearing shells, explosions on one side, and there would be a whistle over our heads and then an explosion. And those explosions were going on all night. There was gunfire everywhere. This was not the usual night in Kigali with the sporadic gunfire. And people were screaming, people were crying for help. It seemed like everything was crumbling around me. And I started shaking. I was so scared. My stomach was bubbling. I was like out of my mind. I felt like I needed to go to the bathroom. I would go one way to the bathroom and then an explosion and I start running the other way. And I was just like completely all over the place. And then eventually I became numb. The next day, the neighborhood looked untouched, but then started the chase on Tutsis, where mobs of extremist Hutus were going around house to house killing Tutsis. And they were killing them with machetes and weapons. Bodies were piling up on the side of the street. Remember, the killing with hand weapons had already been going on for 4 years, but I hadn't actually seen it up close. I hadn't actually experienced it in terms of seeing somebody get killed. But then we started seeing dead bodies. And at one point, one of my neighbors actually chopped down somebody that he was my big brother growing up. He was my neighbor, but he was like my big brother. He chopped him down and killed him in front of all kinds of people, and people were so scared. So we went into hiding, and I was hiding with my mom, my two sisters, and some neighbors. And eventually we were rescued out of our house by some neighbors. So what happened during the genocide in '94, there were some horrible things happening, and there were a lot of good people doing great things. People like Paul Rusesabagina is the biggest example. If any of you have seen the film Hotel Rwanda, but most people who survived in the genocide in Rwanda survived because their neighbors or strangers gave them shelter. They took them in. So we were taken in by our neighbors, and we stayed with those neighbors until the RPF did not stop killing. They were also still rounding people up. There was a stadium, the biggest stadium in Rwanda. The National Stadium is one of the places where they gathered people, and they would take them away and kill them. The difference between the extremist Hutus and the RPF, which are the extremist Tutsis, was the extremist Hutus were killing people and putting them on display. The RPF was hiding the people they were killing, and in some cases, they actually burnt the bodies to hide the evidence. So this went on for 3 months, that genocide period. But during that time, the bombing continued and got so close that the house that we were in got shelled, and this family decided you need to go to a place that's a little bit safer. If I can stop for a second and give you perspective about the displacement. Before the genocide, I told you there was over 1 million people that were displaced into the city of Kigali. That's like taking 40 million Americans. If you take every Black person that is in America and move them to Chicago right here in this period of 3 years, or New York, or Houston, or any other part of America, it's that much. And just imagine the resources, and you know what traffic's already bad here. But what traffic would be like, or getting groceries, it'd be like getting toilet paper during the pandemic, at the outset of the pandemic. So now there's even more displacement of everybody in Kigali now. So when we left Kigali, we kept getting stopped at checkpoints. We were in this pickup truck, and they kept threatening to kill us. At one of the checkpoints, they actually stopped us, took me and my mother out of the truck, left everybody else on the truck, ordered the truck to leave. And when that happened, usually it was, you're dead. And what happened was they took us away from, a guy looked me in the eyes and says, say goodbye to life. And they walk us away from the street, take us to this little carpentry shed in the middle of a bamboo forest. And the bunch of neighbors, people we didn't know. We had traveled so far away. I don't know those people. If I saw them today, I would not recognize them. If they saw me, they wouldn't recognize me. They ran up and they started yelling at them and say, don't kill them, leave them alone. Don't kill those people. It was mostly women, some children, some older men. And they slowed them down enough to where the driver left twice, came back twice, and brought two different men who started pleading for us. Before the pleading, though, while these people were yelling at them, the people were getting ready to kill us said, go borrow some shovels and hoes from those people and dig your own grave. That was for me and my mother, because and they say, because we gotta bury you after we kill you. So the negotiators came and they pleaded and pleaded and pleaded and pleaded for hours. And at the end, one of them said, you know, this boy and his mother are not gonna make it 5 miles from here. Let somebody else kill them. And somehow they agreed to that. And we left, we got on a truck, everybody was crying. People thought we had already been dead. And so then on that truck, the driver took us to another family. This family kept us for months until the bombing by the RPF got into that town, the town of Gisenyi, Northwest Rwanda. And we all now exited. The whole country was basically homeless. More than 2 million people crossed the border into the Congo in the space of 3 days. And I can probably stop right there. Yeah. Just, that's a little bit of a snapshot of, what it's like to be a child in the middle of a genocide. And
that's just insane. You were 10 to 13 years old, 10 years at the beginning, 13 when the genocide happened. I mean, imagine what your life would have been like if you would have encountered something like that, and how that affects people as you're growing up and over time. We're talking about refugees here, and you're talking about a lot of people going into refuge. Why do people go into refuge? You are unfortunately an expert on it, having lived through it. I mean, what causes this? Why does it happen? Do people do it voluntarily?
I was talking to somebody who did not want me to speak out on the atrocities today that the government of Rwanda is committing, the government led by Paul Kagame. And he said, and I was talking about the atrocities in the Congo. And he said, but there's a lot of Congolese refugees in Rwanda. And I said, what do you think happens if I start shooting off some shots here? What are you gonna do? You're just gonna run to whatever place is safest. So people become refugees because they are forced to leave their homes. The saying that, home sweet home, there's no place like home. It's real, especially for people who are refugees or who become refugees. People don't just get up and start and get up and move and go places, especially places they don't know, become homeless. When we went into the Congo, we had a spoon, a cup, a pot, and a plate. That's all the belongings between myself, my 2 sisters, and my mother that we had. Nobody leaves their home having things and being settled, going to school. For people who work, if they work, whatever it is, you're in your community and you just leave your community and go. There's a circumstance, usually a horrible circumstance, that causes people to leave. In this case, it was war and genocide. And sometimes it's natural disasters. If anybody here is from New Orleans or Houston, places like that, where there's been like flooding. I mean, there was some really terrible hurricanes in Florida not long ago. People evacuated. Being a refugee is actually evacuating, is saving your life, leaving everything behind to remain alive so that you have a chance to possibly live again and start all over. It's starting from zero, from where you were in life. And it's because there is an atrocity or a disaster that is happening and causes people and pushes people into leaving their homes.
And by definition, as a refugee, you're leaving your country, you have no citizenship, you have often very little rights when you get to the new place, and you have to start everything again. And luckily, you ended here where it gave you the opportunity, but a lot of people don't. And
Correct.
It's very difficult to get there.
Correct. The film that Scott is made is called Stateless. Refugees are stateless, but the film itself, that Stateless film, actually does have a lot more context to why those Rwandan refugees are stateless. Not only are you have no country, you have no home, you have nothing, if the country that you're going in does not recognize you as a refugee, you're an illegal immigrant and forced by circumstances. You have no protection. And generally, if you go to a place that doesn't have the infrastructure to support you, it's also very traumatic, because one of the things that we experienced when we got into the Congo was horrible sanitary conditions, because the only source of water was Lake Kivu, which is the lake that divides Rwanda and Congo. That lake had dead bodies from the war and genocide in it. People were bathing in it, animals were bathing in it. And that was the only source of drinking, cooking, bathing water. So refugee life is nothing to brag about. And it's not really something that people people look for. People would rather be in their homes. And by the way, when you are running away from your home, every single day, you're thinking the next day you're going home. The next day, things are bad, but you're like, man, we're going home tomorrow or next week. You keep thinking that until, you start facing reality and actually accept reality and make adjustments. And if you're fortunate, like I was, then you also can do even more than just survive. You can find ways to thrive and make a difference.
Thank you. I want to be sensitive of time here because we're already about 25 minutes in, but I want to ask you to tell a brief story of when you were in the United States. And I know you were in Tennessee and you were having a rough time, but something in particular led you to activism with your experience in Tennessee. Can you talk about that a little bit?
When I first came to the US, I hated America. I hated America because, for one, I didn't speak English, so I couldn't communicate. I couldn't get along with people. I not that I couldn't get along with people. I couldn't connect. The second thing was just getting used to the place and the things. Like the food is different, the weather's different. So there was also culture shock. Things like, in the wintertime, you see the sun out. I would see the sun out and walk out in some shorts and get frostbitten. Those type of things, I struggled for at least the first year adjusting. The second thing was I wanted to get away from my story. One of the things that happened, I wrote my story once for a class, and a teacher said, this isn't, there's something wrong with your story. This is not what we know. This is not the official narrative. And I just thought the teacher was an asshole. And I can't remember what I said in the review at the end of the year, or I wouldn't say. But then for another couple of years, I didn't. And then later, I wrote it for a contest, and I won in the contest. That was a little bit better result from sharing the story. But then I still was like, I want to get away from this story. All of that behavior was actually me betraying my own wish when we were standing in that place where they were saying, say goodbye to life, because I knew that I was going to die in that place. And the thing that I wished for was, I hope, even though we're dying here, I hope somebody tells the world what is happening to us, what's going on. And I had betrayed that because I didn't want to do anything. I didn't want to share my story. I didn't want to tell the stories of other people who had been killed and everything. And eventually, when I went to college, I worked in a children's library. And I would I would chat with friends, and then they go offline, and then I would get bored and read books. I didn't like reading then. But then, as I read the books, I got to the African-American section, and I read a bunch of books, and there was one that I couldn't put down, and it was the Frederick Douglass book. And I was like, this guy was 7 years old when he was sold into slavery. And he basically himself says, I'm like somebody's horse. He doesn't know his age. He was somebody's property. A human being was somebody's property at 7 years old. Taught himself how to read and write, freed himself at 21 years old. I was close to that age when I read that book, and I felt so useless. I was like, what am I doing? I've got this story. This guy has done so much by sharing with the world the evils of slavery. And I was thinking, if somebody could do this much by sharing his story, by narrating the evils of this practice, and actually contribute this much to the abolition of slavery, which was very profitable, lasted for hundreds of years, was a global operation, and in so many ways, an impossible system to get rid of, and he could make a difference, I need to be doing something. So that book really inspired me. Frederick Douglass inspired me, and I started sharing my story. At the time, there were horrible atrocities taking place in the Congo. 4 million people had been killed in the space of 4 years, and nobody knew about it. People, you probably don't know about it. You might be hearing about it for the first time. 6 million people have been killed in the Congo since 1996, a little bit before you were born. And those people, not many people talk about them, but I wanted to share the stories of what it's like for the children who are in the Congo and suffering these things, and also call out the perpetrators who happen to be the government of Rwanda and Uganda, who invaded the Congo and created chaos in the Congo. I wanted for sure that the world understands that this isn't Africans just fighting Africans because there is supply from the Western world. There is political protection and financial profits that are all connected with that conflict. And I wanted to make sure, first, I just really wanted to share stories of the children. But then once we formed AGLAN, the African Great Lakes Action Network, is when I really, really wanted to make sure that the world understands and wanted to advocate and make sure that there is change.
Can you tell us a little bit more, again, just in the interest of time, a few minutes on the Great Lakes Action Network, what you do there, what your focus is, what kind of human rights work you do? Educate,
advocate, and really work to bring about change, engage, get people to engage. So our goal and our mission is to bring about peace, justice, and prosperity in the Great Lakes region of Africa. And we believe that that is a global challenge. It's not a local thing. Again, it's not Africans killing Africans. It's a global issue. Just like the apartheid South Africa was a global issue. There are global players. And so we believe that by educating, we can get more people interested. So platforms like this where we raise awareness, people will not care unless they are aware. So raising awareness. Some people would never care anyway, but we care about them. We care that some people do care, and we want to make sure that the information is there. We work with the survivors and victims of those atrocities to work on a path toward justice. Justice, which includes holding accountable the perpetrators and reparations for the victims. And so we work with the victims in that, and we believe that by pursuing justice, justice will lead to lasting peace. Lasting peace will lead to a thriving region. And it starts with hearing the voices that are kept out of the conversation. There's something that I've heard before that says, when you hear a story, listen to who's telling the story and whose voices are left out. So we put a big focus on the voices that are left out so that that story can come to the fore.
It's like we rehearsed this in terms of going through the different things. Speaking of the voices that are left out, let's go to Survivors Uncensored and talk about the book, 100+ stories of Rwandan genocide survivors. I've worked with many Rwandan expatriates and know a lot of their stories. And one thing that I've learned is it is incredibly hard for people to speak out. First, it's just as you said, it's hard to speak out about trauma. It's hard to make a decision to share your trauma, whether it's genocide or other types of trauma, with people beyond yourself, with even family, with the world. That's a tough decision to make, and for genocide survivors in particular. So talking about trauma has always been difficult, but then in the Rwanda case, there's Paul Kagame's government in Rwanda. And they often prevent people and have a chilling effect on people speaking out, whether it's inside the country or outside, in that they act against anyone they consider a critic. Not limited to the two of us, but many other people too. Can you talk about how hard it was for you and for others in the book to decide to speak out, and what brought you to organizing this book?
Yeah, let me start with how hard it is to actually talk about these things. I want to kick a shout out to somebody that I consider a big brother, Aimable Karasira. He was a university professor. He is a musician, a singer. He also had a very popular YouTube channel in Rwanda. This is somebody whose family, many people in his family were killed in the genocide in '94. Then afterwards, his parents and his sister were killed by the RPF. And because he's talked about it, now he's in prison. And many people, because he's a known person, it wasn't as easy to get him to kill him immediately, but many people are killed for that or disappeared. Now, there is another famous person who in recent times was actually killed for recognizing that there's been atrocities against Tutsis and against other people who are not Tutsis. And this is a gospel singer, Kizito Mihigo. He was very famous, very beloved in Rwanda, got killed. And so those are the consequences of sharing stories like this. So all of that to lead to shout out to all the survivors in Rwanda who shared their stories in this book. We did everything we can to conceal their identities so that the government would not go after them and kill them or disappear them or jail them. With jailing is like the lightest of the things that they can do, but even when you're jailed, you're tortured. So the difficulty of putting stories like this, again, shout out to everybody that provided their stories here, because Rwandans, even in America, they are afraid of making their stories public because the government of Rwanda will go after their families and harm their families in Rwanda, or go after those people and kill them or harm them. But this was many years coming because people have been censored for so long. There's a big thirst for liberation. And so for many of the people who shared their stories, and it's a great honor, it was a great honor for me to be a part of this project where we are sharing these stories with the world. They basically said, you know what, even if I get killed, I don't want to die with this story not being known. We survived so that we can tell the stories of those who did not. And that is the spirit in which this book was put together. When we were collecting the stories, shout out to my co-authors, when we were collecting the stories, people were afraid. Like people would say, I can't send this in audio or I can't do it in writing. I need to meet you so I can give you the story. In some cases, some people, they backtracked. They decided not to include their stories because they were afraid. And the collection was in multiple formats. Some of it was audio, some of it was video, some of it was in writing. It was in multiple languages, mostly in English, French, and Kinyarwanda. And so all of that was the work to get it done. But the thing was that the people who decided to share these stories here, it's an act of bravery. It's like the one example that I can use that maybe resonates everywhere is like survivors of rape are shamed many times. When they tell the story, it's people start bringing doubt about their experiences. And so many people choose to remain silent. That culture, that type of rape culture is the type of culture that is prevalent within the Rwandan community when it comes to sharing their stories of the atrocities that they suffered, especially if it includes atrocities committed by Kagame and the RPF. So it was an act of bravery and courage for many of the people who share these stories. We have been for many years, but in recent years, we've been fortunate to get so many people who are willing to to start coming out and speaking and sharing their stories publicly, because they're saying, I have to liberate myself. I cannot keep carrying this backpack and adding rocks and rocks and rocks into the backpack, because eventually those rocks are going to break my back, and they don't want their backs broken.
Maybe, I want to go to Q&A soon, but maybe just 2 or 3 minutes. Can you tell a story or two from the book that really sticks with you?
One of the stories, I think it's story number, let me double check.
Yeah, please.
It's story number 72. William Adams. He's a doctor now. He's actually a university professor also. This is somebody, when the war started, he actually experienced the war in the north of Rwanda before the genocide, when he was a teenager. And he fled through Rwanda. He survived so many massacres, lost a lot of his family. And he crossed the Congo with the RPF chasing the refugees all the way across the Congo. So one of the things that I didn't share earlier was that after those refugees went into the Congo, the RPF chased them into the Congo and committed a genocide in the Congo against those Hutu refugees. He was one of the people that survived. After surviving in the Congo, he crossed 2 other countries, got into Gabon, and he was kidnapped. The story of Horus is not the first kidnapping that happened by the government of Rwanda. Kidnapped by one of Rwanda's generals, General Charles Kayonga, who is deeply, deeply involved in the Congo, abducted a group of people. And when they took him to Rwanda, they said every day they have to kill 30 of them. He survived the torture in the prison and eventually was able to make it out alive. I think that's a story that sticks with me the most. There are a lot of difficult stories in the book to really pick out, 2 or 3, but that one is probably the one that covers almost just about everything that's happened.
Yeah, and I remember that story very clearly. The whole book is a very quick read, but incredibly difficult, but also in just everyday language. It's just people telling their stories as they go through it.
Yeah.
I think maybe we can talk a little bit more, but let's go to some Q&A. We've got a microphone. Would anyone like to ask any questions of Claude? We'll go back to a couple others, then we'll get to Scott. Scott can ask questions all day. Please.
Hi, you mentioned that you wanted to hold perpetrators accountable for the actions they've committed. How do you do that when it's governments? Or how do you approach that?
It takes campaigns. First of all, it starts with us here in the rooms, because I'll talk about the government of Rwanda. The government of Rwanda is a dependent government on foreign aid. We who are sitting here are some of the taxpayers whose taxes actually go to those governments. So part of that accountability is actually holding the US government accountable for sponsoring financing a dictator, a mass murderer, a genocide perpetrator. That's one. So start with cutting off the money. The other piece is boycotting products from Rwanda, boycott the tourism to Rwanda, so that eventually without the money, they cannot commit the atrocities. They cannot afford to commit those atrocities. Now, what is gonna happen is they will eventually lose power. And when they do, they're gonna face justice. Now, while they're in power, only the president has presidential immunity. There are different ways, I don't wanna get too technical, but there are multiple mechanisms of actually holding individuals accountable to where they can actually face consequences for their actions, which include sanctions against those individuals. It includes freezing their assets that are in countries that are participants. There's something called the Global Magnitsky for people who engage in illegal detention, torture, and things like that. There are so many different things that can actually be used for even members of the government, except for a president, a sitting president, which is why anytime Paul Kagame says that he's gonna leave power, I don't believe him, because he knows he's killed so many people. And if he ever leaves power, he'll probably end up in jail.
I will say one of the great things, and you started to mention it, Paul Rosales, beginning of being kidnapped, had at least one very positive result, and it's that it got a lot of the problems with Rwanda in the news. We were just talking about this a couple hours ago. There was a New York Times article, reporter named Uncensored 2 days ago, and it's the first time ever that Paul Kagame, the president of Rwanda, has been called a tyrant on the front page of the New York Times. He's been called an authoritarian and several other things. Usually he's the friendly authoritarian who does good things. 2 days ago, he was called a tyrant. That is significant movement.
Thank you for that, because part of what we can actually do is make sure that the truth is known. Make sure that we continue to raise awareness. Make sure that we do our part. So what you've heard here, make sure you share it. Invite a speaker, share the stories, share the articles, like the article he's just talked about, and things like that, so that people know. Because a lot of times people are just thinking, oh, you know, this is the greatest president since sliced butter when you think about, you know, Paul Kagame, until you hear the stories of people who've actually survived these atrocities.
Great. Other questions?
In your opinion, do you consider the Rwandan genocide a double genocide?
Do I consider the Rwandan genocide?
By both sides, or a genocide?
I'll tell a quick story to answer that question. I was doing a presentation. It was at the UN, and somebody came, and I get heckled a lot. If you look at my timeline on Twitter, if anybody has ever looked at it, I mean, I get all kinds of hate on Twitter, where people say that I deny genocide, or that I'm you know, pushing this double genocide theory. So I was at the UN and I talked about how the Tutsis suffered a genocide and the Hutus suffered a genocide. And somebody who came to heckle said, oh, he's a genocide denier. They said, why? Because he said that there was a genocide of Hutu people. And so the people said, I think it's probably more accurate to accuse him of saying that he accepts a lot of different genocides. So for me, I do recognize that in Rwanda, there was genocide of Tutsi people and genocide of Hutu people. So yes, the double genocide, it's not a theory, it's a reality, it's a thing. People, with the Tutsis, it's been very well established. With the Hutus, not only were their killings systematic, but they were selected specifically on the basis of their ethnicity, with the purpose of exterminating all of them or part of them. And that is the definition of genocide when it's on the basis of ethnicity. It's an intent to exterminate in whole everybody, or in part some of them. And that happened in Rwanda.
It's one of the interesting things you're saying, double genocide. It's actually kind of a term of art in Rwanda, because the Rwandan government likes to say, as Claude just said, we are both genocide ideologists and double genocide theorists and genocide negationists, even though we talk about the genocide all the time, but we don't follow the Rwandan government's preferred story. And that's kind of where that comes from. In Rwanda, there was a genocide against the Tutsis, and all Tutsis are victims and all Hutus are perpetrators, and all Hutus are terrible, even though a very small percentage of the Hutu population actually took part in the genocide. There was a terrible genocide against the Tutsis. There's no doubt about that. It just wasn't the only thing going on. Other questions? Over here.
You mentioned that when you escaped Rwanda as the genocide was falling out, that there were several million Rwandans fleeing to the Congo in the span of 3 days. Can you describe that experience of being one of three or several, I don't remember the exact number, but several million people trying to cross the border over to the Congo and being literally chased out by, you know, the rebel military?
Yes. So, you know, how long does it take when you get to a stoplight and it says walk? How many seconds do you get? Anybody know? 15 seconds, 20 seconds, 35 seconds in large cities and large intersections. I mean, Chicago's a large city, so I'm sure there are places where it's like 35, seconds. The house that we were sheltering in, which there was, and again, I'm grateful for that family because it was a mom, a dad, 2 children in a 3-bedroom house, and they took in over 30 people. All of us were in there sheltered, and we didn't have anything. They gave us everything. The house that we stayed in was like this wall, and all you had to do was cross the street and you were in the Congo. So the back of the room would have been in the Congo. And it was middle of the night, like 2 or 3 a.m. when we heard the commotion, people screaming, babies crying, goats and, dogs and cows and, motorcycles and cars, everything, all the honking. And we started trying to cross. And it wasn't until midday the next day that we were able to go that distance, that far. And people who fell down, they were trampled on. So they were like people getting trampled on and dying. If you lost the hand of the person that you were with, you lost that person. If you were lucky, you found them days later or weeks later. So it was like a terrible commotion with the bombs and the shootings right behind us. It was scary. It was scary. You just wanted to like break through. So the tension was so high. It was so deep. Once we crossed into the Congo, I felt free. I felt like I just got out of hell. Although we were now homeless and we had no food, no water, no place to sleep, and those 4 belongings that I talked about, a spoon, a cup, a pot, and a plate that somebody gave us. And so the RPF was behind us, just killing as many people as they could, bombing the crowds and shooting indiscriminately into people. So that was the scene.
I think we have time for maybe one more question.
Thank you for speaking with us today. I was wondering your thoughts on to what end do you believe Western countries had a role in the genocide, for example, with the assassination of Habyarimana, the Rwandan president. More recent findings that the French involvement in that. I was wondering what your opinion is on to what end should Western powers be held accountable for either ignoring or almost contributing to the sparks of the genocide and the conflicts in Africa.
Thank you for that question. I think it's one of the most important questions because it also has that big, you could wonder, why are we even talking about this in Chicago, right? It's because this is something that we're involved in. That war, when the war started in Rwanda, Paul Kagame, who is the president of Rwanda now, who at the time was an officer in the Uganda military. So the Tutsi refugees who came as the RPF into Rwanda many of them were part of the Uganda military. Paul Kagame was in America training as a Ugandan officer. Then he left and went to lead a rebellion in Rwanda. And after that, led a rebellion into the Congo. And what is crazy and I was gonna say funny, not funny, but it does make you laugh, is that this this group of people, a friend of mine, Congolese activist Kambale Musavuli, calls them criminals without borders. You know, you heard of journalists without borders and doctors without borders. We also have criminals without borders. They started in Uganda. They claimed they were Ugandan citizens then. They came to Rwanda, committed atrocities as Rwandans, went into the Congo and occupied government posts, calling themselves Congolese. And all of this, Rwanda and Uganda do not manufacture weapons. So before the genocide, the government had the support of the French. The rebels in the country of Uganda, which was supplying the rebels, were supported by the British and the Americans. And so the Western powers definitely have, it's not just, they were not just bystanders. They were actors in it, remote actors, not direct actors, but they were actors. Today, the fact that it takes so much to get an American resident kidnapped into Rwanda to actually bring him back shows how deeply involved the American government is involved with the Rwandan government. What is happening today, Paul Kagame has turned his military into a mercenary of the West, where today Rwanda is involved in the wars in Mozambique and Central African Republic and many other parts of the world. And basically where Western countries are not willing to send their militaries, they'll pay Rwanda and Kagame to send their troops there. So there's definitely accountability on the part of the West because of the support financially, the military support, and the political and diplomatic support that they have given to war criminals and genocide perpetrators like Paul Kagame and once before him.
Thank you. I'm going to take moderator's priority here and take the last question. So we're sitting here at a Jesuit school. We're not just supposed to listen, we're supposed to get motivated and do something. And when talking about Rwanda, I often think back to my favorite scene in Hotel Rwanda, and I think it's the really kind of the story of the movie. It's, for those who've seen the movie, Paul Rusesabagina, the hotel manager, it has a couple of reporters in the hotel, and the reporters have just sent out pictures, the first pictures of the genocide. And one of the reporters is in the restaurant, and the reporter meets Paul, and Paul says, "Thank you. Thank you for telling our story. Thank you for bringing word out to the world." And the reporter looks at him and says, "Yeah, the story's gone out to the world, but I don't think the world's going to do anything. People are going to see this story. They're going to look up from their dinners. They're going to say, 'Oh my God, that's horrible.' And then they're going to go back to eating. I don't want them to go back to eating. What should they do?"
So definitely go back to eating at some point.
No, not till you're done.
But there are a number of things that you can do. One is, you know, when you hear a survivor story, you become a witness. When you become a witness, you become responsible. So share the stories. Second thing is, I'm here, I shared my own story, but I'm also sharing the story of the 100+ survivors who accepted the danger of sharing their stories, and so help them get their stories out to the world. The third thing is, and I'll leave it at 3, make sure that as American citizens, as taxpayers, you know, some of you write, tweet, you know, you're on social media, make sure you challenge the US government to stop supporting dictators. There are many ways to organize, but I'm here, you know, for the African Great Lakes Action Network. I'm a part of the African Great Lakes Action Network. So I think one of the ones that we really need to start with is Paul Kagame. Stop sanitizing his crimes. Hold him accountable. Stop sending our money to Paul Kagame so that he can use that money to come and kidnap Paul Rusesabagina or kidnap me or somebody else, basically where I and you are paying for my own assassination or kidnapping. And so those are the three things that I would ask you. Share the stories. Definitely, if you've read the stories in Survival Uncensored, share those stories with the world. And thirdly, hold your government accountable.
I'll add one more so Claude doesn't have to. If you're interested in this, we've got copies of Survivors Uncensored. It's a fantastic book with incredible stories in it. Encourage you to pick up a copy here. They're also on Amazon, but since you've got them here and Claude will sign them and stick around for a few minutes afterwards, as long as people are here, happy to stick around and chat. Thank you all for coming and listening. Questions, Claude? Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Recording stopped.
Fantastic. It's nicely done. Thank you for shutting me down. Got it. Yep, I received it. Thank you.